What's going on, everybody, and welcome to another 60 feet 6 inches, your fantasy baseball podcast over at fakepigskin.com. I'm your host, Kyle Robert. You can follow me on Twitter at NotoriousKRO. We got a full house today, fellas. Coming to us in your middle of your screen, it's Damian Dabrowski. What's up, Damian?
Another rare Sunday appearance, Kyle. You know, usually it's when things go wrong you see me here on a Sunday, but this time being proactive, being responsible. Got a big bachelor party next weekend, so giving the liver and the wallet a little break this weekend.
Yeah, something you have to do. I think I got my big fantasy football draft next weekend, so I've been doing much of the same. My guess is by next Sunday it could be a little rough if somehow we both manage to make it here. It might be a solo show for you, Mr. Ben Rolfe. How's things?
Good, thank you. I've had another busy weekend full of the cricket and the cycling. So those of you who are regular listeners will remember last time, a month or so ago, when Damien last graced us with his presence, he told us all he was keeping up with my miles compared to pints. So Damien, if you've had a weekend off, you're now 70 pints behind. I expect you to have caught up by the end of the podcast. Challenge
accepted.
Yeah, my guess is by next weekend, Ben, you'll be about 70 miles behind, but we'll see how that goes. Yeah, he'll spin it around on you, and we'll see how this goes. So, guys, obviously there's a lot to get into. Big news, obviously, with Bryce Harper, but I wanted to kind of talk trades off the top. Obviously, in some leagues, the trade deadline has passed, but in a lot of other leagues, it's coming up soon, or there's just not one at all. So, Ben, I guess I'll have you start. If you're in a keeper league, you're kind of starting to look at your team. You realize it may not be in the cards for you to be a legit contender this year. What's your stance on kind of moving pieces and acquiring other pieces that could be, really valuable keepers, next season and beyond?
Yeah, it's kind of like there's kind of three elements to this. One is if you're kind of out of it. One's if you're in this sort of middle ground, which I am in our staff kind of keeper league that we have, and one where you're still in it. I've been out of one league now for a month or so. I traded a few pieces for draft picks best part of a month ago. Unfortunately, my team sucks that badly that no one wanted any of my other pieces, but I was in a sort of full-scale sell bar, sort of my 5, 6, 7 pieces that I really wanted to keep. It's an 8 keeper with contracts and stuff, and so there was sort of 7 or 8 guys I really didn't want to trade. They're the ones that I kept hold of, and then I just tried to sort of sell off anything. I tried to sell off Jose Peraza and Jonathan Villar just in the hope they might get 5 steals the rest of the season, and just get rid of saves. Obviously, if you're still in it, you're trying to chase things down, and you've just got to throw offers out there. Like, you've just got to throw out offers of 2 young keepers for Mike Trout. Say, for example, the guy who's in 12th has got Mike Trout. This is an example from one of our leagues. And I just tried to chuck him sort of 2 really young players, not 2 doing well, but just to see where we could go from there. But the trouble is with that strategy, you kind of run the risk of insulting them and just them not wanting to deal with you anymore because they think you're just trying to rip them off all the time. So you've got to kind of balance it. I know we might have had some discussion in the preseason with me and Damien differing a little bit on this. So that's what you're in it, but it's when you're in that sort of 3rd, 4th region, which me and you are actually in, Kyle, and we were trying to make a trade that benefited both of us. What you've got to try and do is deal from those positions of strength. So my position of strength was power and RBI. So I'm topping home runs. I think I'm topping RBIs as well. And so I traded you Giancarlo Stanton and JD Martinez as the kind of main pieces from the hitting side in order to try and acquire Chris Archer and Gio Gonzalez, just because I've made an absolute mess of getting my pitching to the innings limits, and now I'm desperately scrambling for anything. And that was kind of the piece that Clayton Kershaw was in it, but we'll get to him in a little while. That's kind of the 3 different extremes. You've got you kind of sell at all costs, but keep hold of maybe the main pieces that you want to build your team around for the next year, especially if you think you're in a position where you can challenge in the next 2 years, which I think I am. Buy without absolutely compromising yourself for the future, and then you got that middle ground where you've just got to try and make some trades that maybe work both ways. And if you can't swing them, then maybe you go into like the full scale buy mode or the full scale sell mode, depending on how you feel right before your deadline.
Yeah, and Damien, if you're kind of in that middle range, and if you make a couple pieces, you can make a couple moves, add a couple pieces, and all of a sudden, you might have a legit shot at contending, but that might mean giving up on pieces that you're kind of relying on going forward. And I had Daniel Murphy as a nice value, but I ended up selling him because I needed to make up some ground at other spots. I mean, if you're sitting kind of in that 3, 4, 5 range, you think if you make one or two trades, you could actually contend. But I guess where are you? How do you make that decision whether you need to go all in? Or if you should say, hey, maybe I'll pack it up and try and go for a little keeper value, or maybe kind of find a middle ground. Like, what's your general philosophy in that round?
Well, so if it's a roto league like ours is, I think you just have to kind of do the math and look at where you are in the different categories and see how many points you can make up. And look at the people above you and see if you make up those points, or you making up directly against them, if they're going to be dropping in the standings and you make up those points. And if you think there's a legitimate shot that you can pull it off, then you should go for it. Because as they say, flags fly forever. And it's hard enough to win a championship. And when you feel like you have a chance, if there's, some teams that are making themselves sellers, that are putting pieces on the market, and especially like in our case where you're only keeping 8 guys, I think if it's a true dynasty and you're keeping your whole roster, it can be a little bit harder if you really basically trade away all your young pieces. But chances are you can still find 8 guys that you want to keep. Like in our case, while trading away some young pieces, maybe your keepers won't be so great as a whole anymore, but you don't necessarily have to mortgage your whole future just for this one season if you kind of pick the right guys to trade. But it's complicated. I think it is kind of the fun of being in a keeper league, where just because you're out of it doesn't mean your season's over. You can still try to make deals. But at the same time, I think that if you already have a team, because you'll have people coming to you, I'm sure, offering you not so great players for, somebody like Mike Trout, and this isn't necessarily an example of what Ben was saying earlier. I just mean in general, where somebody can come to you and say, well, you can't keep this guy, so anything I give you is basically better because you're just going to lose him at the end of the year. And that's not really the case either. You shouldn't, if you already have 8 solid keepers, unless somebody's going to give you a keeper that's going to be better than those guys, you shouldn't start trading away, your star players just for the sake of trading them, because in that case, you're just going to be affecting kind of the balance of the teams that are still competing for it. And when there's not really an incentive for you to do it, that can come off a little sketchy sometimes.
Yeah, I wonder.
My kind of counter there, sorry, Carl, my kind of counter there on that is that baseball's very fluid. We're going to get on to talk about some injuries, and I'm always looking to try and have 10 guys, maybe. And what it means is if it means trading away, like last year I had Paul Goldschmidt, if it means trading away Goldschmidt for a couple of those kind of pieces that maybe aren't going to improve my team, but if, say, for example, let's say Miguel Sano slips over at home and breaks his arm, and we know he's not going to be back for this next early part of next season, that may affect whether I want to keep him next year. And if I've stuck to those 8 guys and I've not built a kind of backup plan, and that's what I'm kind of thinking. If I'm well out of it, if I'm 10th, 11th, 12th, no shot, that's where I'm coming from. It's not, obviously, if you think you've got 10 or 11 guys to select from, you're not going to do it, but you've just got to. And this is the great thing about keeper leagues. Every keeper league is different because everybody has different rules on their kind of punishment for keepers, so to speak. And so it's great because you can get 100 different trade offers almost, it feels like, with the same 3 or 4 constituents in them. And you'll come out with a different option every single time, it feels like. And that's what I absolutely love about these kind of semi-shallow keeper leagues. They're a lot of fun to be in. The trade implications are a lot of fun.
Yeah, and I think understanding kind of your keeper rules and how many potential keepers you can have is critical. And, as you go through the season, evaluate, kind of have a short list of, okay, these are the guys that would be in consideration for me. That way, when it gets around this time and someone's offering you a deal, is, okay, if I get this guy and he's one of my keeper, is he going to be better than, the handful of names on my list? And that's the same thing goes for free agent pickups too. I know, some leagues it doesn't work the same, but in our league, basically if anybody you pick off the waiver wire is going to be one of your last round guys. So, you could pick up a guy who quote unquote helps your team, a little more. Maybe he bats 20 points higher, maybe hits a few extra home runs, but in the long haul is actually a worse keeper. So you drop, that kind of impactful player for a younger, more upside shot, and then maybe that player becomes a value heading into the next season. So that's something else. Damian, I guess, how do you evaluate, kind of your solid players, guys that, yes, they're going to be keepers, but probably more in the late single digits, maybe 10, 12, 12th round range versus guys that, obviously if you can keep a young player in the 27th, 26th, 25th round, like how do you debate, kind of those two guys and figure out, okay, yes, this young player isn't as good as the guy I could keep in the middle rounds, but the fact that I can keep him for 5, 6, 7 more seasons makes him, worth so much more to me. Like, kind of, how do you evaluate those two kind of guys?
Well, so I think it depends on if you're looking at those older guys that are going to be that probably still have keeper value, but let's say like you had Daniel Murphy, like what was it in the 12th or the 13th?
Yeah.
Or I know one of the recent trades we saw had Hanley Ramirez and Mark Trumbo in it. And I think Hanley was like a 7th round keeper. Trumbo was like a 12th or 13th round keeper. I think it depends obviously you have to look at kind of the aging curve. Is it a player that's going to have one more great season and then they're probably not going to be, a top 50 player anymore? Or is it a player that you still think is going to perform, at a top 30 level for at least 2 or 3 years? So in Murphy's case, I think that's somebody that I have obviously no problem keeping. But I think if I'm looking at, guys like Hanley Ramirez or Mark Trumbo, Trumbo will probably outproduce being a 13th round keeper, but I don't think he's ever going to be a top 5 round player. Yeah. We saw even after last year, which was his career season, he still, his ADP before this season was in the 70s. So that's not a player I'm going to prioritize over, say, like, I have Michael Conforto in the last round, or I have Jose Ramirez, in the 25th round, because I think those guys are going to have a much longer prime, obviously, based on how young they are. But I think their prime is probably going to be even better than the best we've seen from Trumbo. So in that case, it's an easy decision. But I think I'd be reluctant to basically, use a 8th, 9th, 10th round keeper and a guy that I think is never going to be more than a 6th or 7th round pick. And that way, the value you're basically getting on that keeper is 2-3 rounds. Whereas if you can get a guy in the 20th round, even if he's never going to be a top 5 round player, if he's going to be a 7 or an 8 round player, that's still 12 rounds of surplus value. So you kind of have to weigh what you think of the upside of the player is and how long he's going to be able to be in that prime versus how great the production of kind of the more proven veteran is relative to his ADP.
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. And another thing you'll want to think about, maybe you're a team that was a contender, but you're dealing with a few injuries. Maybe you lost a couple key pieces, and you realize that maybe this year isn't the year, but maybe next year, or it could be a year where if you add a couple vets and get some of that surplus value, you're a title contender next year. So I don't mind trading for a few of those older guys and getting a couple rounds, but you really have to know your team, really have to know where you're at, and to Damien's point, if you can get two players that are going to have maybe 7th, 8th, 9th round type value next season, if one of them's in the 10th round and one of them's in the 25th round, obviously that guy in the 25th round is much more valuable because you're getting all that extra value. So Ben, I guess let's talk Kershaw, because I think he's a very interesting name around this time of the year. Obviously, I traded for him. It's a big risk for someone trading for Kershaw at this point, but it's also it's one of those things that if he comes back and is back soon, is already throwing on flat ground, could be a huge difference maker down the stretch. I guess what were your thoughts, kind of selling on Kershaw, and do you kind of expect him to be a difference maker down the stretch, or are you kind of thinking, okay, maybe he comes back a little bit, but the way the Dodgers are kind of set up, they don't really have to rush him back, and in terms of fantasy value the rest of the way, there wasn't a ton there.
Well, my thoughts kind of were that I was being bullied by Damien about the fact that we're 2/3 of the way through the season and I've only just passed the halfway mark on my innings pitched in some kind of weird protest against winning. And Kershaw couldn't really help me, because even if Kershaw came back tomorrow, he would help me, because obviously he would give me another, let's say he goes through another 10 turns. You'd think Kershaw's going to average 7 innings. He'd offer me another 70 innings maybe. But what I need now is I needed more than that. I needed maybe 2 starters, and that's what I sort of managed to do, was turn Kershaw and some other really good pieces into 2 guys who I'm hoping are going to give me 120, 140 maybe on the upside if Gio and Chris Archer stay good. I think Chris Archer's capped just from the simple fact that he throws quite so many pitches early on in games. But my issue with Kershaw is just simply, if you can wait, say, for example, if you're in your playoffs, or you're in those kind of top 2 in the roto and you just want to stay there and make a push in the final month, like in the final couple of weeks, I think now's a good time to acquire Kershaw or stick with him. But if you're challenging, if like, I like what you've done, Carl, where you're sat third, you've got Damien who's been sort of the runaway leader the whole year, and you're just trying to make a gamble that you can catch him. The trade you bolstered with your power, and then you've added Kershaw as a side piece. If you get to within 10 points of Damien, and then Kershaw comes back and gives you that boost in your pitching categories, you're going to think he's going to win games. You're going to think he's going to give you good Ks, good ERA, and good WHIP. I mean, there's every possibility you could pick up those 10 points in those final sort of 2-3 weeks of the season. And if nothing else, just make Damien sweat for the first time in 2 years of playing this fantasy baseball league, because he's had it far too easy. And next year we need to work something out to stop the commissioner winning, because I think there's something dodgy going on.
Yeah, and I think that was kind of my hope. I'm really hoping for, especially in this league where we have to, we have a certain innings cap and we have to get there. And but once we get to that point, basically nothing counts. So my hope is that Kershaw can come back and give me 50 Kershaw innings instead of, patching together the Brett Andersons and Trevor Cahills of this world. But Damien, I guess, is Kershaw somebody you're interested in acquiring at this point, and kind of what are your expectations of him going forward?
Well, it's completely contingent on where you stand in your pitching categories. And I mean, I obviously agree with Ben that he's not a guy you can get if you're looking for volume, because regardless of how good he is, the fact that he's still in the DL and we don't have a hard date on when he's going to return, he's not going to give you anywhere near the volume of really any healthy pitcher right now. But if you are in a position where you're a couple ERA points or a couple WHIP points from making a jump in the standings, then he's the perfect guy to get. You're probably not going to have to pay as much for him as you would, obviously, if he was healthy, because the fact that we don't know when he's coming back basically makes it such a gamble that you can get him at a pretty big discount. And if you can do that, even if he comes back for, let's say the last 3 weeks of the season, if he gives you 4 or 5 starts, that can be all you need to make a jump in ERA if, you're 0.02 behind or something like that. So as long as you have a couple other guys to kind of keep you afloat in volume and you don't end up in a situation where, kind of like what happened with Ben, I mean, he's been on a per inning basis, he's had the best pitching staff all year long. He's had the highest K per 9, the best ERA, the best WHIP, but he wasn't competing in Ks and wins just because his volume was so much lower. So in that case, it's a gamble of, okay, now I'm going to add volume and hope that these guys are good enough where I don't lose that lead. But if you're in a different situation like most of the other teams in our league are, and you're just trying to see how high you can get in ERA and WHIP, then, Kershaw, or if you went out and got Bumgarner a few weeks ago, those are kind of the guys that are going to be able to maximize their value to you in that context.
Yeah, and then Ben, I guess, you finally jumped on board of the taking Kershaw real early in your draft. Obviously was great until he got hurt. Are you comfortable taking him there kind of going forward?
Yeah, I am. I think what I learned from this was not that I made a mistake with Kershaw. I put too much weight into Kershaw and Rich Hill. And I mean, I knew with those two what innings I got were going to be so much better than anyone else. I lucked into Zach Greinke. I'll be honest, I drafted him as well. And if I could have just put another couple of pieces, a bit more reliable, I lost Mania to the DL. Tehran blew up for me. What I learned is that I put too much faith every year in, say, 3 or 4 starting pitchers instead of trying to get maybe 5 guys that are going to be there every day and then just have one place that rotates. And while you were streaming the god-awful, I wasn't streaming at all. And kind of, I think Damien put it right. I think watching you throw out names of god-awful pitchers scared me off doing it to an extent. And it's stupid because in a points league, I've been streaming all year and doing really well at it. And I think it's just difference in the depth of the league. The other league is 8 or 10 teams with deeper rosters, whereas this is a 12-team league with a fairly knowledgeable group. Like there's at least sort of 8 guys there that really know what they're doing and aren't just letting the really good pitchers sit out on waiver wire. And what I did was I invested too much in the draft in relief pitcher. I think my relief pitching staff was Betances, Miller, Azuna, Melanson, and then I picked up Bud Norris quite early on and Keone Kayla, and I think I rode these relief pitchers too much for the amount of starting pitchers I have. I think my strategy would have worked perfectly if I'd had more reliable person than Rich Hill as my sort of third best starter, but it's definitely not put me off taking Kershaw in the future. I think the trouble is I think Kershaw's naturally going to drop a little bit now because I don't know why you would take him miles ahead of Max Scherzer anymore, because we've now seen this injury happen over 2 years. I think next year we're going to be talking about Kershaw in that second round rather than maybe that first round. Maybe we're going to be looking at Max Scherzer as the first round guy. I think when we get into next year, probably the fact that he's Clayton Kershaw and that he's healthy at the time of talking will make us drag him back up. But it was an interesting gamble, and I've absolutely enjoyed owning Kershaw. And I think I read a little bit too much into the fact that when you draft Kershaw, supposedly you don't really have to worry about pitching for the rest of the year. And apparently I forgot to worry about pitching at all for the rest of the year. And that was kind of my mistake, but it's kind of part of a fantasy baseball season. There's going to be periods where you're going to fall asleep. And if you make that mistake, you can drop out very quickly, because I had every chance of winning this league this year. And that's something I'm going to have to learn from, and something I'm going to take into a lot of my other fantasy baseball leagues. And that's just an interesting thing to learn. I think everybody can do with having a great pitching staff like this at some point, and then just not maximizing it like I haven't, because it's a lesson, and it's something, like I say, that when I draft next year, I definitely won't be pushing starting pitchers so far down my board.
And Damian, in a league like this where there is an innings cap, do you find it more important to kind of get those starting pitchers that you can rely on? Obviously, you're going to have to stream and deal with injuries and whatnot, but do you kind of push starting pitching up a little bit more in these kind of leagues, where in other leagues where there, maybe it's a weekly league, maybe, there's no innings count? Are you more comfortable kind of waiting in those leagues and then being more aggressive in innings cap leagues?
Well, it's kind of a weird juxtaposition, because as a whole, I'd probably say no, but part of that has to deal with the fact that I do think a lot of people kind of do what Ben did, where if they get a couple strong pitchers, it's very easy to basically, and those pitchers are doing well, like in Ben's case, where Greinke and Kershaw and Hill, everybody got off to such a strong start that it's almost naturally you feel like you don't really need pitchers because all your pitchers are doing great. And it's easy to forget that even if they all have amazing seasons, those 4 guys all pitch 200 innings, that's still only half of the 1,500 innings you got to fill. And I think outside of you, I don't think people have been very aggressive about streaming pitchers in our league for the most part, with the exception of kind of that moment when you realize you're so far behind the innings cap. So I kind of take advantage of that, knowing that there's going to be streamers available. And my approach has kind of been that I've just been very quick to pick up guys that I thought could become something, like I did with Alex Wood earlier in the season, or with Trevor Cahill when he was still with the Padres. Because my thinking was, okay, it's not going to cost me anything to pick these guys up, and if it turns out they stink, I can drop them the next day and move on to the next guy. But in the cases, especially of Wood, they can become a guy that now I have, I've gotten 120 innings out of this year that I didn't factor into when I was drafting. Obviously, it kind of balances out because, I had Drew Smyly and Steven Matz, who were hurt for so long at the beginning of the year. But I think it's when it makes sense to pick up guys that you believe in, that, especially like in Wood's case, where they have health concerns or they have workload concerns, but for the most part, when they're pitching, you think they're going to be good. Take your chances on those guys and hope that, you find a couple that will give you, between the two of them, 200, 300 innings over the course of the year, because it's just going to, when you add that to what you already have, it's going to take you most of the way there.
Yeah. I think that was a really good discussion, guys. I think we should move along. Let's talk some news. Let's talk some call-ups. Let's talk some stuff and help people get ready for the rest of this season. So let's talk about Bryce Harper. It was a very ugly play. He go running in through first. It looked like his knee kind of went backwards. It looked like ACL, MCL could be a huge issue. The MRI shows no major damage. They're saying it's a significant bone bruise. Damian, in terms of Bryce Harper, obviously a guy that, was one of the best players in fantasy baseball. I guess, what are your expectations for him? And kind of how can owners rebound or kind of fill in the gaps until he's back?
I guess if we're looking at kind of what the Nationals have released so far in terms of injury information, it's obviously, I'd say, good that it doesn't appear to be ligament damage. Now, that said, that doesn't necessarily mean we're going to see him again until maybe the last few weeks of the season, hopefully. And it's kind of that situation where we talked about with Trey Turner, where Washington has such a big lead right now that they don't have a need to push these guys back. They're still going to make the playoffs. So their only concern is going to be to make sure they have their best team come the postseason. So I can't expect much from Harper the rest of the year right now. Even if it's a case where he's fine, I think they're still going to hold him off until the last couple of weeks just so he gets, we don't want him sitting out for 2 months before the playoffs, but they probably don't think he needs more than a few weeks just to kind of get back in the swing of things. So I'd be expecting to be without Harper. I think, again, we said this with Trout. When an injury like this happens to, a bona fide first rounder, you're never going to replace their production on the waiver wire. What you basically have to do is look at where your team is in the various categories and prioritize, do you need power? Do you need steals? Do you need average? Are you pretty much the same in all of those spots? And you're looking to see if you can find a guy that can give you a little bit of something in each category, even if he doesn't stand out in one. So I think that's where Bryce Harper owners are right now.
Yeah, I know the Nationals are expecting Michael Taylor and Jason Worth back very soon. I think Worth's in AAA. Michael Taylor's back any day now. So both those guys will probably fill in. It is pretty crazy. The Nationals have lost probably their two best everyday players to issues with the bases. I know we kind of joked about it before, Ben, but are we kind of potentially looking at a scenario where they make the bases kind of even with the dirt or much lower? So, stuff like this, stuff like hand injuries, sliding into the base, that kind of stuff becomes a thing of the past. And players have one less thing to worry about when, they're sprinting down the line, they're running as fast as they can, they slam their knee. And, when you're used to having that extra 3 to 6 inches to go down, and it's not there, it can mess up your kind of running motion, and injuries are occurring because of it.
Yeah, it's certainly interesting. I think if they go to lower bags or bags that are like more built into the turf, then you're going to have to go probably away from this thing of having to stay in contact with the bag at second and third that you've got at the moment. I think it's going to be more... I actually think you could now go to a point where you don't have to remain in contact with the bag. You just have to go across it, kind of thing, like you do with home plate, like you do with first to an extent. Like that to me is sort of common sense. All I've got to say on Bryce Harper is he's a prime example of what we've just talked about. If you own him in a keeper league, you've got a couple of weeks now until your trade deadline. I think you have to try and sell him to a contending team. If there's no, obviously if you can keep him, you don't have to, but if there's no way of keeping him, I think you sell him now and you try and get what value you can, because to somebody who might be challenging, a Bryce Harper coming back with a week or two left in the season could be absolutely key, and that's what I think they do. I really don't think they're going to rush him back, because why? The Mets are no challenge to them. They're going to win in that division. They're going to be in that situation where they're going to have to face the winner out of the Central. Nothing is going to change that now. They're not catching the Dodgers. They're not falling back. There's no rush to bring Turner and Harper back. I think they're going to ease them in. I think it's going to be a kind of very slow process getting them back and just making sure everything's right for the playoffs. And I think to an extent that's what they're going to do with Steven Strasburg as well. I just think they're just going to ease him back in. Low workload.
Damian, if you're in a redraft league and you own Bryce Harper and the playoffs are coming and you don't have a DL spot, like, is it like a scenario where you're going to drop Bryce Harper, or are you maybe going to wait kind of to see exactly what the news is before, but assuming that, yeah, he's injured, he's out for a while, and probably won't help you, until maybe late in your playoffs? Is it a scenario where you're like, I got to cut him and make room for somebody else?
I think in a roto league, you can absolutely make that move. Just because you don't have to deal with the head-to-head playoff aspect. So, even best case scenario, I'd be surprised if we see Harper before the end of August. I think he's going to get a couple weeks regardless. And if anything, in September he comes back. And in that scenario, 3 weeks of production from Bryce Harper are obviously still meaningful. But it's easier to make that move than if you are in a head-to-head league, because he can obviously be the difference maker in an individual matchup. So that's kind of how I'm looking at it right now. It obviously depends kind of on your DL spots. Maybe you have somebody in there that is a little bit more expandable than Harper is, but it wouldn't shock me, and I wouldn't criticize anybody for making that move, just because there's such a strong likelihood that we really don't get much out of him the rest of the year.
Yeah, I mean, if you were looking for pure power, Joey Gallo would be one of the guys I'd be targeting. Obviously, 70% owned, so adding him in some of your leagues is probably going to be a lot harder to do. Minnesota has actually been raking pretty good. Eddie Rosario has 5 homers, 12 RBIs, hitting 300. and Byron Buxton has actually been pretty solid too. So if you're looking for some outfield help, those are a couple names. Manuel Margot also is somebody that obviously won't give you as much average, but has been stealing. And so if you're trying to make up a little ground there, I think those are a few names that I would throw out.
Yeah, just to add in a couple more, I think Josh Bell and Trey Mancini both have outfield eligibility in Yahoo. They're around 50% owned, so shallower leagues, but you can definitely get some power there. I like Rosario, who you mentioned. He's been really hot of lately. Shin-Soo Choo's only around 23% owned right now. He's one of those rare guys that, isn't great anywhere right now, but he's giving you a little bit of everything. 14 homers, 10 steals. He's only hitting around 250, but we know that can go up, and he's going to get runs leading off for that Rangers lineup. So there's a couple more names there for you.
Yeah, and Ben Revere and Rajay Davis, if you're looking to add some steals, both have 6 steals over the past 2 weeks. So if you need to add a little speed, and even Jared Dyson has 4 steals, and he's hitting 350. So I mean, there is some steals potential that, if you're trying to make up a little ground and you lost Bryce Harper, I wouldn't hate going that way either. Let's talk catcher, and let's talk Willson Contreras, who is arguably one of, if not the hottest hitter, one of the hottest hitters since the All-Star break. Has a hamstring issue, obviously, on the DL. Damian, you're our catcher guy. Alex Avila, a guy that if you need catcher help, obviously has been a wasteland of a position all year long. Is Avila a guy that you're adding and looking to use kind of at least until Contreras is back full-time?
Yeah, depending on the depth of the league, he's certainly a pretty viable option there. He had that really hot stretch with the Tigers, where he was playing a lot of first base as well when V-Mart was out. I don't think we're going to see quite that level of production. I think it's a little tougher in the National League just without the DH and with the lineups turning over a little bit, differently. So I think his plate discipline is still going to play there. That's obviously more helpful in points leagues than Roto, but I think there's a couple guys. I know James McCann is one name, and Manny Pena, who I still can't believe he's only, I think, 15% owned, given the fact that he's basically playing every day now, and he's hitting close to 300, has some pop. So those are two guys that I definitely would probably add before Avila, but that I think are available a lot of places that you can use to replace Contreras for the time being.
Yeah, I mean, McCann's hitting 333 with 2 homers, 10 RBIs, and a stolen base. And is widely available, only 17% on Yahoo. So that's definitely a guy. Christian Vasquez, if you're just looking for some average, gonna chip in a little bit and not kill you. I don't hate him. And Tyler Flowers has actually been pretty good, and he's hitting 5th today for the Braves, hitting 300 on the season. So there's some guys that if you're in deeper leagues, you need some catching help. You can pick up and kind of make it work. And those are all good names who we can target because Russell Martin also hit the DL with an oblique strain, Damian. Is he a guy that, if you can pick up one of these other guys, are you just going to cut Martin, or are you going to try and hold on to him and then when he comes back, stick him back in your lineup?
I think you have to cut him, and it's tough because catcher is so bad, but oblique strains are almost always at least 4 to 6 weeks. So we're talking about, anywhere between half and 75% of the remaining time we have left in the season, and you just can't. It's too hard to keep a catcher on your bench, especially one that's on the DL. So, as tough as it is, he hasn't been having a terrific year, but by catcher standards, he's still been very productive. So, it's going to be hard to do, but I think I definitely think you have to cut him at this point and just get see what you can get, but just don't take a zero for that time.
Yeah, I think that's very fair. Let's talk about Neil Walker, leaving the New York Mets, heading to the Milwaukee Brewers. Ben, obviously, Jonathan VR, Orlando Arcia were kind of your middle infield for the Brewers. Do you think Neil Walker kind of overtakes one of these guys? Maybe VR slides to short. I know Travis Shaw's been dealing with some injuries, so obviously they can play all 4 of them until Shaw's back. But kind of what are your, I guess, expectations for this infield and kind of what Neil Walker can bring?
I think they're bringing Neil Walker in for that kind of veteran presence. Travis Shaw is still a very kind kind of young and raw kind of guy. It's starting to feel like he's been around for a while, but he's really only sort of been 2 years on the scene now. Eric Thames, he's a veteran in terms of age, but in terms of experience in the major leagues, what it's going to be like to compete now, he's not a guy that you would lean on. And obviously Orlando Arcia, he's a young guy. The amount of innings and stuff that he's now had out there in the outfield in his legs is going to start to take its toll. I think what they're going to do is VR is going to become the guy that sort of spells Shaw. It's clear Shaw is struggling more and more as the season goes on. If they can spell him 1 or 2 days a week, if they can give Arcia a day off, and if they can give Walker a day off, and maybe even give Eric Thames a day off. I don't know how the leagues compare in terms of where he's come from, but you have to believe that he's not used to going this deep and having to play this many games with the pressure that he's got on him and the higher standard of baseball that he's had to play. So they're going to be able to rotate those 5 guys. I would imagine some of them can cover the outfield. It's just a good move, just to add a bit of depth, add a bit of experience. Neil Walker knows what it's like to go there and do it in the playoffs. He's been there a couple of times, and he can really help. I mean, he's never been successful by any means there, but he can absolutely offer this club something down the stretch. It's an interesting, very low-cost move that's just going to allow them to try and build something. And as unimpressive as he's been, hopefully he can add something to this club, and a club that no one thought had a shot to even, well, let's say we all thought they were going to be in the shot for who finished last this year, not for the playoffs. So I like the fact they've tried to go all in a little bit here. You've got to take advantage. They've got a sort of a middling club. They might as well go for it, and this is a great move.
Yeah, Damien, you're obviously a Mets fan. You watch a lot of Neil Walker. He has some power. Obviously, that got zapped in the move to Citi Field, but do you expect him to kind of play second base? Obviously, he's playing there today, hitting in the 4th spot. Do you think VR maybe slides to 3rd, Shaw could be to 1st, and then it's kind of just a constant rotation, or how do you see this shaking out?
Yeah, I think they're going to move those pieces around. I don't think Walker's going to be an everyday player, but he's definitely a valuable bat to have, being a switch hitter and a guy that, we've seen hit for power and for average in the past. So he's got some versatility there. And we'll see. Like I said, definitely, like Ben was mentioning, Thames could see some more time off. We'll see if Shaw, he's nicked up a little bit with the foot injury. We'll see if he misses any time. I think VR is going to be, a good piece to have just for his base running, but they probably don't want him getting everyday at-bats with his struggles either. Arcia's kind of picked it up at short, so I think he's going to continue to see everyday at-bats there. But I think Walker's obviously a guy, we know that the Brewers have particularly with Braun, but guys that kind of need some more maintenance than your average major leaguer. So I think Walker's going to find at bats, but I don't think it's going to give him much value outside of only leagues. Or in a deeper mixer you certainly can, but I just think it helps in a daily league where you can shuffle him in and out versus a weekly league where you put him in and he might only play 4 games that week.
Yeah, so in daily formats, if you need middle infield help, is he a guy that you're comfortable adding?
Yeah, absolutely. You want to look at a split, see who he's facing that day, but I do think he's definitely going to value, especially if he continues hitting in the middle of that lineup.
Yeah, around Braun and all those guys. Let's talk about Mr. Jay Bruce, another guy that left your New York Mets, Damien, heading to the Indians. Is this just like kind of a let's add some depth to our bench kind of thing, or do you think Bruce could see, consistent 4 to 5 day, 4 or 5 games a week kind of playing time?
Well, given how well he's played this year, I do think that the Indians, they made the move definitely wanting depth, especially with Brantley going on the DL. I think that's going to tell us that he's probably going to miss, more time than just the minimum, Brantley that is. Mm-hmm. But I do think Bruce is going to play, close to every day.
Yeah, it feels, I'm looking at the Indians depth chart right now, and they have him listed as their starting right fielder. Zimmer obviously will play center. Ben, are you on board with Bruce, kind of being an everyday or most day kind of guy for the Indians?
Yeah, I think so. I think with his power, they're going to at least start with him. They might have other options they want to bring in more defensively later on. I'm just having a look at the roster now, and he's sort of in a platoon, but with Brandon Guile or Austin Jackson. Like, I'd rather have Jake Bruce in there pretty much every day. And I mean, there are options if they want to give Edwin and Carlos a day off where he could shift into a kind of DH slot and get him out of the field occasionally. So I think it's a great move. I'm not sure I understand it from a Mets point of view. I don't know what the return is, but it just seems a very strange move to have made at this stage. But maybe the opportunity just wasn't there at the trade deadline, so they've left it till now. But it's definitely an interesting move. I'll be very intrigued to see come the postseason what he brings to them, because, like, I mean, him as a fourth outfielder and then using Bradley Zimmer maybe off the bench and doing it that way could be really intriguing. From a fantasy point of view, I think we'll see a slight uptick, but he's not been bad this year. I mean, he'll struggle to have an uptick on what he's done this year, but I mean, we'll see a slight uptick on maybe what we kind of expected when we drafted him. And so I'm intrigued by this. It's really interesting to be around a great offense like this. He could add some real runs and RBI and really be a contributor down the stretch for fantasy teams.
Yeah. Ben, we talked about it a little bit last week. We thought it might be happening. I was a little more skeptical, but Rhys Hoskins got called up by the Philadelphia Phillies. Damian, I guess, this is a guy that has legit power, has been up for a couple of days. Do you think he's a guy that if you're looking to add a little power, you're taking a gamble on?
Yeah, he's one of those guys that just hasn't gotten the despite really good minor league numbers, because he never had that pedigree. People have been kind of slow to buy into him. And not to make this comparison, but it's kind of what happened with Paul Goldschmidt, where nobody got really excited when he got called up, just because despite the fact that he was very productive in the minors, he just didn't have the prospect pedigree. He wasn't, on all those prospects list getting all the fanfare, kind of what we see with guys like Moncada and Rosario, who even guys who struggle when they come up just because of where they've been ranked, people get excited for. But I think he's basically Tommy Joseph. I think the Phillies were a little reluctant to make that switch because it wasn't like Joseph was performing all that poorly. But I think he's a guy that over a full season is going to hit anywhere between 250 and 270, let's say, with probably 30 homers, which is kind of what Joseph was parading out to. Now, I think, Hoskins is a little bit younger, and with some of the injuries they've had, I think they've been playing him in left field some. So he's definitely a little bit of a better athlete than Joseph is. But I don't know if they see him as a big part of their future. So we'll have to see if they commit to him or not.
Yeah. It will be definitely interesting. He feels like a guy that probably ends up in the AL as more of a DH guy. They're obviously having issues finding an everyday spot for him. They also had so far he's been up and he's 0 for 11. He's on pace to what was the big guy in the Astros that came up and was like 0 for 23? It was last season.
AJ Reed?
AJ Reed, yeah, he's kind of going on an AJ Reed plan. Obviously has a run scored, has an RBI, even though he's 0 for 11. But yeah, it will be curious to see if he can kind of pick it up and make some noise. Ben, if you're looking to add somebody for keeper league value, is it Rhys Hoskins or is it Dominic Smith, who was recently called up by the New York Mets?
I think it's probably Rhys Hoskins, just because he's the one with the greatest sort of ceiling from a power point of view. It's very impressive the step Dominic Smith's taken this year. He's gone from 14 home runs in 130 games last season to 16 home runs this year. That's a nice little step. I mean, with another 42 plate appearances, maybe we see that get close to 20, and then it's a little bit different. But Hoskins just seems to be that class above when it comes to power. He's not sacrificing a huge amount of average, like a little bit, I mean, but I think we can see Smith's dropping. Smith's been playing in Las Vegas, which is one of the more hitter-friendly minor league zones. So I definitely think that it's Hoskins, but it doesn't mean if Hoskins already gone, you shouldn't gamble with Smith, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, Pacific Coast League in general, there's a lot of hitters' havens, so, if you see a big home run total, it's not always what it's cracked up to be. Damien, what about you? Dominic Smith, Rhys Hoskins, who do you like more if you're picking up somebody for the stretch run, and who do you like more if you're picking him up for kind of future value?
I think maybe in a pure dynasty, I think it would be Dominic Smith. But I'm with Ben. I think for this year, it's definitely Hoskins. I think he definitely has more power potential. And even, I mean, if the Philly, like I said, it's a matter of the team's committing to him, because I do think that both guys could be in a case where they're not necessarily guaranteed every day at bats. The Mets obviously still have, a few pieces they're moving around. Even having moved Bruce, I think logistically it should mean that Smith is an everyday player, but you can't ever trust the Mets to make a rational baseball move. So with that hanging over you, it's tough to be all in. But I do think Hoskins, just given his minor league track record, is probably the more usable piece for fantasy, at least.
Yeah, and for me, Hoskins has a very Joey Gallo vibe. Obviously, if he can learn to hit 275 instead of 220, he could be a very, very fantasy relevant player. But if he's hitting, 220, 230, and he hits all his home runs, he'll have value, but not quite as much. And it will be interesting to see. I remember when Gallo came up, they kind of would play him, and they wouldn't play him. They kind of mess around with him. So I'm going to be curious to see, honestly, for both these guys, how much consistent at-bats and whatnot that they get. Guys, I want to hit on a couple two-start guys. Dana over at fakepigskin.com has her streamers of the week, and she included two guys that are widely available that are both two-start guys, and we'll start with Jared Eichhoff at San Diego, at San Francisco. Damien, I know you've been kind of aboard the Eichhoff bandwagon. He's been pretty solid this year. If you're, looking for a two-start guy, is he a guy, at San Diego, at San Francisco? Obviously, two nice parks to pitch in, two not great lineups. It feels like a really good opportunity here for him.
It is, but it is a lot to do with the matchups. Eichhoff's been so up and down, and he hasn't been great. He's definitely disappointed in terms of the expectations I had for him. Add in that he missed some time with injuries, but I think if you can just hope to get 6 innings, 2 runs, or 7 innings, 3 runs in these starts with 5 or 6 strikeouts, you're going to be happy. Even with the great matchups, I don't think he's a guy that's going to go out there and give you 6 shutout innings. But it's tough, with how bad pitching has been when you get 2 of the best matchups in a week with a guy who in the past has shown us that he can be a reliable fantasy asset. I think you have to roll the dice.
Yeah. The other 2-star option she used was Adam Conley. Obviously a guy that you don't love, but he has the Giants in Miami, and then he's on the road at the Mets. Nice options. Ben, if you're looking at a 2-star option for this week, Jared Eichhoff, Adam Conley, they're both available. Who you taking?
It's Eichhoff for me, just because Eichhoff gets the 2 worst offenses in baseball right now. Conley, I'm interested in. I'd started to do my rankings before I had a few little computer snafus on Friday, which led to me not having my computer and losing a lot. I wrote down some notes from what I can remember, and kind of what I found was that Jared Eichhoff would be a 12-team guy for me, someone I'd pick up and start in pretty much leagues of any size, probably even a 10-team league. I'd be looking to use Eichhoff this week, whereas Conley's probably more 14 teams, but that's probably more a pedigree thing than anything. I'm just a little more scared of the Mets on the road than I am either San Diego or San Fran. So that's the way I'd go with that. But I think both of them are valuable sort of streaming options this week. Eichhoff has the potential to be more down the stretch for you, though.
Damien, Doug Fister's actually been pretty good since joining the rotation in Boston, but has Cleveland and the Yankees this week. Is he a guy that if you own him in weekly leagues that you're comfortable throwing out there for both those starts?
No chance. I don't want anything. I don't want anything to do with Fister when he has good matchups, let alone when he has Cleveland and the Yankees. So, big stay away from me.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think that's pretty fair. But he's a widely owned guy, and it's pretty funny.
He's definitely a Kyle streamer favorite, right up there with Brett Anderson.
I definitely have a few Doug Fister shares. I'm not gonna lie. Ben, what about John Gray versus Atlanta versus Milwaukee? Obviously, both those games are in Coors, but it could be nice opportunities. Are you comfortable using John Gray, or is there too much risk there?
I'd rather use Doug Fister. Just anybody pitching twice in Colorado, I'm staying away from. I mean, the thing with all of these guys, there's quite a few, I say, dodgy kind of options this week. You've got your Julio Teherans, Kevin Gausman kind of things that go alongside that Doug Fister, but I just can't risk John Gray because it only has to go wrong once in Coors to go wrong spectacularly. And I'm not going to risk it. I actually genuinely would rather start Doug Fister, and that's telling you everything you need to know.
Yeah, and that says a lot. Brad Peacock at Arizona versus Oakland. That Arizona one gives me a little bit of the heebie-jeebies, but there is potential there. Dinelson Lamet versus Philadelphia versus Washington. And Ty Block at Miami versus Philly. Damian, if you're in deep leagues and you're looking for somebody, is any of those names, worthy? You can even throw Jarrell Cotton in there, who's got versus Kansas City, nice matchup, but then at Houston. Are you comfortable using any of those guys?
It's just Peacock for me. I think I'm fine using him. I don't mind the Arizona matchup just because he's a guy whose issues really come from walks. Even when he struggles, he's not really very hittable. So as long as you can kind of keep his command and there, then he should be fine. Even if he gives you 6 innings, 3 runs, you should get plenty of strikeouts. And he's got obviously that Oakland start to make up for it as well. But that's really the only guy. Block I know he's been okay lately, but it's just, he's a guy that in a 2-start week will probably still give you fewer strikeouts than most 1-start pitchers. And when you take away when you take that into consideration, it's just not worth it.
Yeah. Ben, what about you? Are you comfortable using any of those guys?
Gonna steer clear of Ty Block, but that goes along my general thing of steer clear of anyone I think might be made up who pitches for the Giants. Dinelson Lamet definitely interests me, just from a point of view that he's a lot of fun to watch, but pitching in Washington does concern me.
Yeah. But if they're playing without Bryce Harper, they're playing without Trey Turner. Rendon's been a little banged up. Murphy's been a little banged up. He could face a much depleted lineup and have a much better shot. Kind of coming out of there with a lot less injuries or runs given up or whatnot.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting, but Brad Peacock's probably the guy for me. He's right on that borderline for me. I would say between. I probably wouldn't use him in every one of my 12-team leagues, but there might be the odd one that I would use him in. Absolutely in 14-team leagues. If I'm ranking the guys we've discussed today, I'm going for Eichhoff. I forgot the first guy we spoke about. Eichhoff, and then Peacock, then Conley, and then Lamet. But it's very close between Conley and Lamet. It's just the fact that there is that danger in Washington that would slip Lamet below Conley for me.
Yeah, you want to put Doug Fister at the top of that list. Just go ahead and do it. Everybody wants it.
I chose not to mention John Gray, Doug Fister, and Ty Block because one's made up, one's pitching in Colorado, and one's Doug Fister.
Yeah. Do you want to use Doug Fister? No, he's Doug Fister. All right. Well, I'm glad we have that established. All right, guys. This is a lot of fun. I'm glad we were able to make this work, get everybody on the cast. Damian, good luck to your liver next weekend. Hopefully...
Thank you.
Yeah, hopefully you don't completely destroy it. That is also my goal. Ben, thanks again for joining us. This is 60 feet 6 inches. We will be back next week for the show. Make sure you're going on iTunes, rating, reviewing the podcast. It really does help us a lot. 5 stars. Leave us a review at 60FT Podcast on Twitter. Send us in your questions. If you're having trade questions, you're thinking about keepers, you're thinking about future value, we're always around to help you. So, but for Damian Dabrowski, for Ben Rolfe, I'm Kyle Robert, and we'll talk to you guys next time.